On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jonathan Howard, Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English at Yale University. His research and teaching broadly interrogate Western ideas about race and nature, weighing their entangled contribution to the formation of a modern world in ecological peril, while also exploring Black expressive cultures as an alternative site of ecological thought and practice. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including generous support from the Fulbright Program, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, formerly the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Harrington Fellows Program. His articles can be found at Callaloo, Souls, Atlantic Studies, and Transition magazine. His first book, Inhabitants of the Deep, The Blueness of Blackness, undertakes a Black ecocritical study of the water as the diffuse subtext of African American literature. It argues that the Blackness, which dawned in the oceanic encounter of Middle Passage, is best apprehended not as social death, but ecological life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jonathan Howard, Assistant Professor of Black Studies and English at Yale University. How are you doing today, Dr. Howard?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's I'm a fan of the podcast, and it's an honor to be invited to a podcast that's had so many esteemed guests, and so doing well. Excited to be in conversation today, and trying to avoid this smoke that's been outside.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate you being here. I'm excited to talk with you, and I too am avoiding stepping outside for any reason today with the air quality. Well, hopefully this weekend will bring some clearer skies and less hazard.
Yeah,
We're
that's
really stepping
that's the
outside.
hope. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get started so I don't take too much of your Friday afternoon. How did you get into Black Studies, and what keeps you committed to doing that work?
How did I get into Black Studies? This is a challenging question because I feel like it's like a fiction of origins. Like picking out a specific origin point is hard, and I think it's more, for me, it felt like more like a gradual introduction, a gradual baptism into Black study as like a practice. So I would say like my introduction, how I got into Black study as a like formal discipline, happened in college when I was a Africana Studies major, and I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I participated in this program at the UPenn that was basically like a program for all incoming Black students. I don't think they can run it quite the same way anymore, but it was called the Summer Institute, and a bunch of faculty from Africana Studies at UPenn sort of ran the program and taught classes in the program. And I was coming from a school. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I went to a school, a PWI private school, that had nothing like Black studies or African American studies. And so this program was like a crash course for me, like an introduction. And I felt like in that program, I arrived at some critical language to describe things that I had already that I knew like in my heart and in my bones. And I remember being really excited by like learning, like it was almost like being gaslit by the world or something like that. And then getting into these classes and learning like I ain't crazy, and like my people ain't crazy. And like there is that the kind of thinking that I was bearing witness to growing up, like the kind of thinking that was happening in the Black church, for instance, which was like a really important space for me growing up, had like a long tradition and had been going on for some time. So I would say so shout out to UPenn and the Summer Institute, and then the Africana Studies Department at UPenn. That's where a lot of my formation happened. And shout out to my teachers, Professor Herman Beavers and Professor Salamisha Tillett. So because I studied African American literature with them both, and they had a tremendous influence on me. But I would also say that how I got into Black study was also growing up and listening to the elders in my family, like especially my grandmother, um, and and just hearing all the things she had to say and how she understood and thought about her life, and our life, like the kind of conditions under which we were growing up. And so and I think once I started to study like formally in college, I was better able to appreciate all the things my grandmother was saying to me
Mhm.
throughout my life. Um, so my grandmother used to say this thing growing up, that is like, what she would say is that she would always say this thing. She would say, "It's a great world if you don't weaken," which I had never heard anyone else say before. And she was always saying this whenever I was encountering any kinds of difficulties and she was trying to learn me, school me, she would always remind me that it's a great world if you don't weaken. So like even something trivial, like, well, it's not that trivial, but I went through like a painful like breakup when I was a kid, and I was all sad, and she used to tell me about like her one of her brothers, um and how like in his like he had a similar relationship issue. And anyway, she would say about him, it went left for him, like he responded to it poorly. Um, but she was basically trying to warn me, like as you contend with difficulties in life, um, like also remember that it's a great world. Like there's like because when you have a heartbreak, it can seem to define your whole world. You can't see past it or beyond it, and every day feels like a slog. I was a very romantic little boy. Um, and, um, and so uh, it was really like a lot of wisdom for her to remind me that there's a world beyond like my horizon of heartbreak.
Mhm.
Like just to have that insistent reminder. That's the kind of reminder I was getting in Black church a lot too, growing up. Um, and that sort of duality of like attending to a problem and also recognizing the possibilities amidst the horizons of possibility that environ that problem, um, was like a consistent pattern. And so I appreciated it in what she was teaching me, and then I was finding it confirmed in what I began to study. Like when I was reading, like when I first encountered the Souls of Black Folk, which didn't happen for me until till college. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and I was just the way, like things like double consciousness and the tension in them, in that idea, just made a lot of sense to me in the same way that like because I had somewhat been primed by like the everyday kind of Black study that my grandmother was doing all the time. Um, and so I would say it's a combination of like my grandmother and her like tremendous influence on me growing up Black in Philadelphia, um, and being in the Black church, where it's like every Sunday you're listening to these sermons, which are like biblical exegesis on the one hand, but also reflections on like the conditions under which we live as Black peoples. And then going to school, finally being in a educational context where I had access to like a bunch of Black teachers and a bunch of Black texts in a way that I hadn't throughout most of my education. So that's kind of how I would say I got into Black study. Yeah.
Thank you. So building on that, especially since you talked about how going to that program really introduced you to like Black study in the academy in a more formal setting. Your PhD is in English. You have an MA in English. Um, how do you situate yourself in relationship to the different disciplines? So English and Black studies, like you're in both places.
Yeah.
um, but I do know that, like, we talk about like most of the Black studies scholars that I initially met were in English. So there's a lot of overlap that happens there. But how do you situate yourself in relationship to both of the disciplines that you operate in?
Yeah. That's a good question. Like I think you're right and I experience this especially where I'm at now, where like the strength of the Yale Black Studies department historically has always been in English. Um, and so and like in the history of Black studies, like English has always been like very powerfully represented. And so in some ways it's been like a very natural, like, so I mentioned when I was an undergraduate at University of Pennsylvania, and there I double majored. I was a Africana Studies major, which is like their version of Black Studies, and I was an English major. And then I went to graduate school where I was only in English, but just because there was no like formal
Mhm.
PhD in African American studies there. Um, but like if you look at the classes I took, it was like the equivalent of, it very much mirrored what my courses looked like at UPenn, being like a lot of literary studies courses that focused on African American literature, Um, and then each of the jobs I've been have always been at this intersection of English. Like my first job at Boston College, I was in the English department, and there it's African and African diaspora studies. And now at Yale, I'm in English and African American studies. So I've always existed at this particular intersection, which to me feels like a very organic one when it comes to Black study. Um, and so in some ways I experience almost no tension at all there, because like I'm a literary scholar and I'm a Black studies scholar, and I as a literary scholar, like in English, I attend to Black texts. And so it feels very, very organic in some ways. I think like the where I primarily experienced the when I first started to feel English as a discipline was actually in teaching. When I became as a teacher, I'm accountable to like passing on methodologies and even teaching certain classes that don't have like that aren't shaped by like Black thought. So like I teach like readings in American literature, for instance. And that was like an interesting moment for me where I had to think like, okay, like because I belong to this discipline, I'm beholden to all these texts that aren't Black texts. And how do I make sense of that? And how do I teach them as someone who's primarily interested in Black texts? And so that negotiating that tension has been like something that I've been learning to do. Um, but like other and in some ways, I feel like maybe I don't really negotiate it all that well, maybe. Like insofar as, let's say, like one of the texts we teach here at Yale, which I've come to love, is Moby Dick, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, right? And at first, I think I resented having to, like, there being a course text, like something we should and must teach. Um, and I think because I grew up having to study white authors for so long, I sort of like had this like a political position where I will only read and study and write about Black texts. And so here I am having to read Herman Melville. And then, but I find that inevitably I read Herman Melville as a Black studies scholar still, even though it's not a, 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 a text by a Black author. But in a lot of ways, what I discover when I read it is indeed in many ways like a Black text. Um, and so like, I find that, there's this thing Du Bois says that gets me, that's always been instructive for me, where he talks about like, um, you know, what is the problem of the 20th century being the problem of the color line. And the thing about a statement like that is that it's a problem that everybody shares. Like, like it's to make a problem, to tie a problem to time, like, then means that everyone in that field of time shares in that problem in one way or another, or their lives are contoured by or shaped by that problem. And so, and I've like, so when I'm reading like Faulkner or reading Melville, I see like very clearly how, or even Walt Whitman, how the problem of being Black shows up in their writing, or their own attention to the problematic of race in the shaping of America, and so of the US. And so I find that actually the like reading non-Black authors oftentimes can be an interesting way to extend my Black study, to show how to think about how the problem of being Black shows up in these other non-Black texts. Um, and so yeah, but otherwise, I really feel that the this particular intersection is feels like a pretty organic one to perform Black study in, and as does I think the other major sort of sub-discipline that I would situate myself in is environmental studies, and the environmental humanities, and that is actually one that's more complicated, insofar as I think I came into that field under under the impression that many scholars have spent a lot of time trying to disabuse us of, that um, growing up in inner city Philadelphia, just that like I don't have much of a relationship to the non-human natural world, and that
Mhm.
Black people in general don't have much of a relationship to the non-human natural world and don't have anything to say about it. Um, and so, and I feel like my scholarly life has been like everything I've read, or my study of the African American literary tradition has taught me just how false that is, right? And so like one important text for me has been Camille Dungy's anthology of nature poetry, Black Nature, which covers 4 centuries of worth of African American nature poetry, where she sort of disabuses us of that assumption that like Black people don't care about the environment and Black writers don't write about the environment. And her main point is that like attending to Black African American poetry and how the natural non-human natural world shows up in it, like part of the reason why there aren't many Black writers in these traditional like anthologies of nature writing is because they write about nature differently, like in ways that defy and disrupt the conventions, and standards of nature writing as we know it, which as a largely white discipline. But anyway, that's I would say is the other sort of disciplinary intersection that I occupy too is like environmental studies or the environmental humanities, and then more specifically eco-criticism, like the study of the relationship between literature and the environment.
So, speaking of that, do you wanna talk a little bit about your book, Inhabitants of the Deep: The Blueness of Blackness? Because I know that that's part of that book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'd be glad to. So, um, yeah, just released a book fairly recently called Inhabitants of the Deep: The Blueness of Blackness, which I describe as a Black ecocritical study of water, the trope of water, in African American literature. And it's a project actually that I was writing. I started as an undergraduate. It took shape in my honors thesis, and then I further developed it as a dissertation at Duke University as a graduate student, and now this book. Um, and it really started because have always been kind of fascinated by water.
Mhm.
Um, Part of this has a lot to do actually with my life in the Black church, where I like was constantly bearing witness to these like very beautiful baptism rituals. And we're just watching people walk to the baptismal pool, and being baptized myself several times because I had to be baptized in like my dad's church and then my grandmother's church. Um, it was just something that was very like visceral to me, and something I it very evocative for me, I guess you could say. Um, and so I think I was already sort of primed in some ways to be like drawn to water, and then as I began to study the African American literary tradition, just noticing how ubiquitous water is
Mhm.
in the Black literary tradition, um, in spite of the ways that you might anticipate or expect water to be overdetermined by, it's especially the ocean, overdetermined by a traumatic and painful association with the transatlantic slave trade. And so, um, so that book began as just like this a very it was like very cultural, like, Black studies project, like thinking about water and the representations of water, bodies of water in African American literature. But doing that work during a time, especially in graduate school, where like there was so much discourse about climate change, um, I started to feel like I can't write about this, like, you know, the the like biggest non-human agent there is on planet Earth, the ocean, right? Um, and in this time, without engaging like all this discourse around climate and environment, and all these scholars who have begun to think about the non-human natural world. So I first went there thinking that like, let me just cover my bases, and like I don't know if I was expecting to find anything all that interesting. Um, and then, but once I did, like once I started reading deeply in the environmental humanities and eco-criticism, what I found actually was that there was a lot of significant overlap with Black studies. It was almost like they were like ready-made collaborators, or like kindred in some ways, but not conversant.
Mm.
Now I would say like that's very different because of some work, a lot of like some recent work that's been done. So now I think it's there's more of like a collaboration and discussion between these two fields. But and I guess that commonality, the overlap I found was like a mutual sort of critique of the human, um, or like so this thing called like anthropocentrism, like the centrality of and the primacy of human beings. Like both Black studies and the environmental humanities had these elaborate critiques of the human on the one hand, and then in a more specifically to my questions around water, I started to notice how water, especially the ocean, and Blackness were analogously positioned relative to like what Black studies scholars describe as the anti-Black world. And so like back to Melville's Moby Dick, like one of the things I was struck by when I read and studied that text deeply was like there's this recurring formulation in that text, in that novel, where Melville writes the phrase "the dark side of," right, and it appears twice in the novel. Once in reference to the ocean, where the ocean is the dark side of the earth, and once in reference to the human species, right, and race, where Africans, and specifically like New World Africans, are the dark side of humanity. And so this like both being like the mutual dark side of the modern world, like Blackness and the ocean somehow as being like foundationally excluded from how we think about human civil life, became like a really like compelling intersection for me. And the language is very similar. Like Melville described the ocean as like what do you call it? He said he used the phrase unsocial. Um, but it was very like in ways to me very similar to and evoke the language of social death that's become so prominent in Black studies. Um, and so like the ways in which both the ocean or the deep and Blackness get characterized as a kind of social death or excluded from human social life
Mhm.
became like an important point of intersection for me. Um, and so that's part of what that book investigates, thinks about like it's one of its jumping off points is like how the ocean and the deep are and Blackness are mutually positioned outside of human social life. Um, but it's also a site of possibility for me, insofar as the ocean also is, more than, 2/3 of the planet. So there's a lot of outside.
Yeah.
Um, and so that to me matters too. In some ways Blackness then has like a privileged relationship to and becomes like for me a very fecund site to think through um what a sustainable human ecological life looks like. Uh and so like Blackness's positioning relative to the deep, what I describe as a deep in that book, becomes like it's both like a site of subjection on the one hand, but also a site of incredible possibility. Like it's an instance of what Black studies scholars sometimes call social death, and a powerful instance of what we could also think of as like Black ecological life. Um, like one of the texts I write about in that book is this moment in Native Son, Richard Wright's Native Son, where the character Bigger Thomas is sort of resigning himself to his death,
Mhm.
and he's in a prison, and he has this like extended reflection where he thinks back. There's like this allusion to the transatlantic slave trade, and he thinks back to like the waters upon which I think the way I'm gonna butcher the language, but the waters upon which some spirit breathed and created him, right? And then feels this feeling of like wanting to sink back into those waters after previously making this attempt to like be a part of the world, the social world of men and women. And on the one hand, that's like it evokes like the language of Genesis and the Bible, but it like maps it onto the experience of the transatlantic slave trade as a sort of origin point, and it sort of confirms, or it's an instance of Black social death insofar as Bigger is explicitly talks about sort of renouncing or being refused um, the world of human social life. But at the end of that passage, he talks about like sinking back into the ocean that created him, and the analogy he uses is like a seed being buried, um, which is there's a tension there for me between like this instance of social death, but also this like ecology, like we know that seeds that are buried in the ground grow
Mhm.
and produce life, um, and so I guess that's one of the projects of that book is Inhabitants of the Deep, is trying to think through the tension between Black life and Black death in relationship to this the what I describe as the language Inhabitants of the Deep comes from Equiano, and it's how he describes folks who jumped overboard or were thrown overboard. And I remember being surprised by that language as an undergraduate because inhabitants is a word for the living, and
Yeah.
these are folks who we know died, and humans can't live underwater. And so there's a way in which Equiano insists life into a space that we would otherwise would associate with black death, right? And and I just found that to be like a recurring thing throughout the Black literary tradition, where water is and the place of the deep is showing up over and over and over again, and it's showing up not just as like a locus of Black death, but more fully even as a locus of like profound life, and life that for me, um, with this like new environmental dimension of my work, or not new now, I've been doing this for a minute, but it's ecological and it's like in its stakes.
Thank you. One, I think it's so interesting to think about the ways in which something that is more commonly associated with death is not necessarily
Yeah,
done, that way when we're talking about Blackness and Black people, and I guess that line from Equiano had never struck me like that before, but you're so right in that, like, you can't I mean, people jumped overboard, they were no longer living, but inhabitants does imply that there is a sort of living that goes on,
yeah.
so that's super interesting, and thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
So you did mention, in when I asked about your relationship to the disciplines, that you didn't really feel a tension between English and Black studies until you went to go teach.
Hmm.
Um, so I wanna ask a little bit more about how Black studies does inform your pedagogy and the work that you do in the classroom.
Yeah. That's that's a really good question. I think it's like I remember like an early class I had coming to Yale where we had this fundamental like debate in class, like a debate emerged between like how do you approach text, and
Mhm,
like approaching text like the way some students thought about it was like a kind of purity, like you like without a lens at all, like you like objectively, cleanly, like almost uninterestedly, and you let the text sort of speak for itself, or you interpret it without any like without coming to it with any preconceptions or any pointed stances. And then there were a set of other folks who were like, nah, like you come at text with like investments and questions and interests and lenses. And so like there were certain students who like really wanted to be like, I want to do a feminist reading of X, right? And that's like coming to a text with a certain stance. And there were other students who were like, that you can't read text that way, because that's like to impose an interpretation or lock yourself into an interpretation. Um, and so I would say like the way that I sort of my approach pedagogically is kind of to let students hash it out and sort of bring forward the stakes of the disagreement maybe and help like the two sides understand one another. But as a Black studies scholar, like I I approach text with a set of investments, right? And there's a kind of ethics of reading that I have, um, that I try to also, teach students. And a lot of it is just simple. It's just like, the primary methodology in literary studies is close reading, which is just like no more complicated, I guess, than just attention, sustained,
Yeah.
curious attention, paying attention. Um, which to me is a kind of ethic. And so I guess, and to me also, I guess it's an ethic that I think of as crucial to a Black studies practice, right? Like paying attention. And so there is a way in which, like for me, I could thread the needle for these students, um, where because the one student felt like they were both committed to attention, and they were disputing um how to pay attention, like the best ways to pay attention. And so some students viewed like approaching a text with a lens as like a failure to attend, because like you're distorting your vision with a lens. You're distorting the text with the lens you put on it. And other students were like, nah, you need a lens in order to see. Like you're presuming that like your pure vision is somehow good, um or pure, like
Yeah.
'cause in most cases like that, like, more often than not, like, this sort of pure, uninterested vision is just oftentimes implicitly white, you know? Like, and it's all the more dangerous because you're not even aware that
Mhm.
you're reading that way. Um, and so I guess, like, pedagogically, the way it shows up is, for example, I don't know why I'm talking about Moby Dick a lot today. Um, but when I teach that text, sometimes it's like the way a Black studies scholar teaches Moby Dick is gonna be very different than, like, if you took the class with someone who doesn't have that set of questions, right? And
Mhm.
so, whenever I teach Moby Dick, I spend a lot of time on the character Pip. Like, when we come, on that chapter in Moby Dick called "The Castaway" that deals with Pip, who jumped overboard a ship, while whaling. um, I spent a lot of time there, even though, the way Melville talks about that moment, he says, like, it's the most significant thing in the book that befalls the most inconsequential character, right? So, like, Pip is a very minor character, so to spend time on him, in some ways, like, a student would be like, "Why aren't we paying attention to these other things?" And, which Melville talks about a lot more in that novel. And I'm just straight up. I'm like, well, I'm an African American literary scholar. So for me, with my set of interests and commitments, when I see Black characters represented in text, like that is a kind of commitment that I have. Like it's a way that it's an ethic that orients how I spend my attention. Um, and so what I basically tell my students is like that's an ethic that I've developed over time. There's a reason, there's a set of motivations that informs why I've made this decision. You might have different ethics, right? Or different you might choose to distribute your attention differently. Um, but what's absolutely non-negotiable is attention, like paying attention. Which to me, like, I still feel like I'm giving them Black studies when I do that, make that point is because I think Black studies in the end is all about paying close attention, like really like that's what when Du Bois I love like Du Bois's language of the problem of being Black, because a problem is the kind of thing that demands attention. Like it's not something that is ever settled, right? It's like a problem for thought. It's something you turn around in your mind, you think deeply about, and never come to any really firm conclusions about sometimes, you know?
Mhm.
Um, it's the kind of thing you study, right? Like Black study. And so this like close reading to me is a kind of studying, a careful, devoted, attentive study, careful study. Um, and so I think that's probably that to me feels Black as hell. And and the way I teach close reading, at least in my English literary classes that aren't necessarily devoted to the Black literary tradition, is the way that I teach that method of like attending closely to a problem or to curiosities, to things that strike you.
Thank you. I really like the framing of Black studies as being something that demands that you pay attention and, like,
Mhm.
emphasizes that, because it is really important, especially to see the ways in which or to understand the ways in which you're not coming to something with no lens at all.
Yeah,
And if you are, it's probably one that was developed by
yeah,
white supremacy and the myth of objectivity. So
right.
so 2 questions, I wanna ask you before I let you enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Mhm.
But what interests and excites you most about the past of Black studies?
Yeah. What interests me most about the past of Black studies? So, what I would say is, and this is, I'm gonna try to actually think about the past, but the question is like, how past is past? How far back do you go? But what's always interested me about Black study is its the sort of ambivalence that seems to undergird it at times, like how many of our luminaries have like felt themselves torn between a thing, like in their effort to pay attention to Blackness, in their effort to think about the problem of being Black, as Du Bois puts it, how they end up I like, there seems to me like a recurring fundamental, like, ambivalence. So, and one of the I write about this actually in an article of mine, uh, in Souls, the journal Souls, an article called, "To See the Earth Before the End of the Anti-Black World," where I develop this idea of Black ambivalence as being, like, foundational to Black study. Like, there's this, like, fundamental tension that, like, we see now in our current moment, one of the best expre or one of the most well-known or popular expressions of this tension is the tension between, like, Black optimism and Afro pessimism, right, that conversation. But it's actually something that I think goes really far back and is sort of fundamental to Black study, like this a kind of two-ness. Um that like and one of its most fundamental expressions, I think, at least in my work, is the tension between Black life and Black death. Like, we're somehow always torn between, giving an account and critiquing forms of Black death or things that perpetuate Black death, and also at the same time, um, giving an account for Black life. So there's this question that, I find really helpful in Christina Sharp's In the Wake, which I know is not old, but I'm getting to the past soon. Where she says, I think the question is like, in the midst of so much death and the fact of Black life as proximate to death, how do we attend to physical, social, and figurative death, and also the largeness that is Black life, or Black life insisted from death, right? And what strikes me about that question is just like basically she's like, how do you pay attention to Black life and Black death at the same time? Um, and that to me is old. Like, that struggle is old, and that kind of two-ness recurs throughout Black study. So, like, you could think of Du Bois talking about, like, the problem of being Black as being both like a problem on the one hand, and, like, he uses the language of a gift, or Spillers, like she in, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. She talks about writing under, the pressure of, um the transatlantic slave trade and the history and the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade as being both, like, on the one hand, like a rupture and a continuity, right? So you have, like, rupture, continuity, gift, and problem. Another, like, two for me, or pair, is, that's become really important in my work, uh, now that it's taken this environmental turn, is Sylvia Wynter and the tension between the plot and the plantation, right?
Mhm.
Um like all these things could be mapped onto very broadly onto like the very broad categories of Black life and Black death, ways of attending to both the structures of domination that Blackness is subjected to or subjected by on the one hand, and like the vibrant, full life that Black peoples practice on the other hand.
Mhm.
And so that like that's probably been the most interesting thing to me about the past of Black study, um, which uh, which is that like this ambivalent. Like there's always been a kind of ambivalence that has characterized the scholarship that has gone before us, right? And it makes me sort of what's so encouraging to me about that ambivalence is that like it actually helps me like not overreact to like the debates, like because what I realize is like this is just what we do. Like we this is the attention that we pay. And like some of us might skew one way or the other, but there's always been this like two-pronged thing. Um Ways of talking about death and thinking and theorizing Black death and ways and thinking and theorizing Black life. Like there's always been this sort of fundamental ambivalence. We're constantly torn between the two. And
Mm.
that's like some people think of ambivalence, or one way to think about ambivalence is like a sort of being like and like a sort of stunned, inactive, like commit, like you're so torn that it's inaction, like it leads to inaction, like you can't decide. And that's not what I mean by Black ambivalence. It's more that like you I feel like Black studies gets very active all the time. It's like one of the most that's why I'm so like that's why I love it so much and so committed to it. Um Yet like I think that like if I'm honest, like I my work sometimes like I talk about people who my book I talk about people who jumped overboard, right?
Mhm.
And I'm struck by how Equiano insists life into that moment. And that's a moment of ambivalence, right? Like, because on the one hand, I know that those folks died, and on the other hand, there's this insistence of life. Like that's a tension. I'm not really interested in like resolving the tension so much as I am, but because of like the climate emergency that we're living in, and because of the ways that I recognize that we don't like the ocean is also excluded from how we think about life, and we don't really know how to live with the ocean or any of the non-human natural world. Like I'm actually caught up by and astonished by like the life that Blackness insists into the deep, right? Um, and so that's like my ambivalence. Like, I get active in trying to think through Black life. Um, and some people might like, you know, think that like this is like a retreat from the truth of that moment, which was like these folks actually died. But I actually see in that genuinely, like it matters to me that Equiano uses those words, and I think about that selection of words. Why does he use those words? Um, and another form of ambivalence I would think about, like talking about like the past of Black study, and this is more like I don't know if Equiano yeah, Equiano is a kind of Black studies scholar, and so, like, one of the important moments in that text is, like, when he first sees the ocean. This is one of the things the book thinks through, and
Mhm.
he describes being astonished. That's the first thing he feels is astonishment, and then that astonishment is converted into terror when he's carried on board the slave ship, right? So there's this initial astonishment on the one hand, then at seeing the ocean for the very first time, even in the midst of the violence of what is occurring in his life, right? Um there's this astonishment, and then there's also this terror, and I wouldn't disavow either one. And they exist beside one another,
Mhm.
and that's profoundly interesting to me, that there could be both astonishment and terror. And sometimes I think in our formulations about Black life, like the terror part gets a little can tend to be overrepresented, or we think about in our effort to be faithful about the thought of that terror and the scope and scale of it, um, we leave out space to also attend to Black life. Which like, in that question, I mentioned earlier in Christina Sharp's question, right? She describes it as a largeness, the largeness that is Black life, right? Astonishment helps me get there. Like,
Mhm.
if Black life is genuinely and is a veritable largeness, like, how do we think that largeness, right? Which is not to say that Black death is not, and the forces of Black death are not real. Um, but like, I'm really interested in thinking the largeness that is Black life. And, so that means that my attention be split. Like, when I see inhabitants of the deep, I'm drawn to that inhabitants, because part of what galvanizes my Black study is this, like, wondrous life, this abundant life that I keep seeing, in the text that I'm a student of. But yeah, that's I'd say, like, the past of Black study for me, like, what's interesting about it, is this kind of ambivalence I see, that recurs over and over again in some of, like, our foundational thinkers.
Well, thank you. So that then leads to what excites you about the future
Yeah.
of Black studies.
So this is an exciting question too, because, and it's related in some ways to this question of ambivalence, because I think of it as, like, a foundational aspect of Black study, uh, but that gets named in different ways over and over again. Um, and so, and one of the most recent iterations, I think, of this tension between the thought of Black life and Black death that's going on right now in the field of Black studies that really interests me, and one that I'm participating in, um, is this question of Black ecology and Black environmentalisms. Um, so, like, my book obviously thinks through and has, like, a huge environmental, like, stakes, right? Um, and it's very invested in the environmental humanities. And then I'm coming out with a forthcoming collection, anthology called Black Environmentalisms, with my colleague here at Yale, Kajitana Heka. But then there's folks like J.T. Rohn and Marissa Solomon and Tally Goff and others, like, who are taking up this language of Black ecologies and Black environments, and thinking through it. And I think in their effort to do so, or one of the earliest efforts to do so, was this, like, essay that's been cited up and down now, by Nathan Hare, called Black Ecology, which is one of these
Mhm.
first efforts to explicitly put the discipline of ecology in conversation with Black studies. And there, in that article, it's mainly kind of an attempt to redress what, or to critique the implicit whiteness of ecology, and to redress the exclusion of Black people from ecological considerations, right? Like, so the thought of ecology as being primarily about, or the environmentalism being primarily about conservation of wilderness, and having nothing to do, for instance, with the toxic environments, especially urban environments in that particular essay, that Black peoples are made to inhabit, right?
Mhm.
And so there, like, it first, the first, like, sort of explicit, like, when you explicitly find Black beside the word ecology, it's an attempt to think through Black environmental precarity, right? Which I would think, which is a form of, a force of Black death. But what's also equally interesting to me about, like, this environmental turn in Black studies that we're seeing in all this work popping up, is that scholars are also thinking about and deeply invested in Black environmental practice. So what actually are, like, what's the environmental knowledge, that emerges out of Black history and Black expressive culture? Like, what ecological wisdom is harbored by Black peoples and Black culture, and Black history. And so, for me, like, in my own work, like, I've come to think about, or I mine Black expressive culture, and especially literature, for, like, Black ecological thought and practice. Like, for me, because of Blackness's queer relationship to the category of the human, for that reason, it's sort of a privileged site from which to think of a ethical, a sustainable human relationship to the non-human, right? Um, And so for that reason, almost like categorically or metaphysically, Black culture and Black art, Black thought becomes like is like for me a promising place to start to think about what it might mean to live well on planet Earth. Like there's this question that Alice Walker asks that I cite all the time in this very small little known book. Where she says, where do we start? How do we begin to correct like humanity's relationship to the world or something like that? And for me, I start with Blackness, like Black life. um, I like, and like in my book, I start with the inhabitants of the deep, and I argue in that book that Blackness is an ongoing inhabitation of the deep, like it's the legacy of a peoples for whom the ocean could never and the deep could never be like on the outside, because it was such a fundamental part of how we came into the modern world in the first place, so yeah, I think like as far as the future of Black studies, this thinking about Black environmentalism and Black ecology as like on the one hand the study of Black environmental precarity, like it's just we know that Black and brown people are disproportionately exposed to
Mm-hmm.
climate change and the dangers of climate change on the one hand. So there's this kind of like exposure and toxicity on the other hand, like we also know that that the modern world is a problem, like, and part of the ecological crisis, like it stems from a set of thoughts about what it means to be human, a set of ideas about what the non-human world is and is for, that are harmful and that are like deeply steeped in racism, like and racial ideas, right? And um so for that reason, then like our sort of loophole of retreat, or one loophole of retreat, to use Harry Jacobs' language, in like climate crisis and ecological crisis, for me, is Black literature and Black thought, like how Black writers represent the non-human natural world in ways that trouble and circumvent and disrupt, unhelpful ideas of what it means to be human, unhelpful ideas of humanity's supremacy to the non-human natural world, or lack of any ethical obligation to the non-human natural world. And so that's like, as far as like the future of Black studies goes, that's like one, like it's a development within Black studies that I participate in, and it's one I'm really encouraged by and excited for as it continues to take shape with so many. Like I named a few, and I'm sure I left some out that I'll be regretting later. But there's just so many folks right now who are thinking through or turning to questions of the environment and Blackness's relationship to it.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, I've noticed that as well, and I think it is very important, but also fascinating,
Yeah.
and I don't say inspiring, but like the potential and the possibilities behind that, um, is helpful right now, I think,
Yeah.
particularly right now. But
Yeah.
so is there anything you wanna add before I give you back the rest of your day?
Mm. Anything I want to add? Um, I think one thing I just cite, or maybe a good note to end things on, in the knowing that so like two things we're dealing with now. We have it's orange outside because of wildfires in Canada.
Yep.
We can't eat lettuce because it will give us upset tummies, right? And so like there's all this evidence around that, like are like the signs of crisis are becoming increasingly conspicuous, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and so like one and for so like when I say, like, I look to, like, when Alice Walker says, where do we start? And like I say, African American literature. One example for that is like on a day where it's orange outside, Octavia Butler's parable of the sower becomes really important. Like because that's a world that's on fire. And if we need instruction for how to survive and live through and create new worlds within a world on fire, that's part of the manual is right there. Like people have been living through emergency for a long time and thinking about emergency for a long time. And so we have resources. And so that's like what, like that's why I like going all the way back to that question of attention. Like it's simple, and it seems almost so simple that it's like it's not like it seems like almost romantic to talk about like the world's on fire. It's like, and the solution to that is to pay attention. Like why pay attention or why read books when the world's on fire? But but all you have to do is just recall that part of how we find ourselves in this problem in the first place is a failure to pay attention. Like we have not paid attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's part of like what the Western world is visited upon the globe, right, is in some ways like a failure to pay attention, like a misapprehension of the earth and what it's for. And so, attention is a kind of climate solution in its own way. And so even like when it's orange outside and we can't eat lettuce, it's like, all right, man, like, part of parable of the sower, like part of what goes on there is agriculture, like plant, like the people who are less bothered by what's going on right now are people who have gardens, like who are like growing their own food. And so they can eat lettuce because they're like have figured out a way to get food, outside of our systems, and the systems that we got right now just aren't very good for us and for the planet. And so, yeah, I would say that, like, I think, shout out to Octavia Butler, who teaches us how to live in an orange world. And, and that teaches me at least that, it's worthwhile to pay attention to how we've been, like, none of this is new. Like, Black writers, artists, thinkers, intellectuals have been reckoning with life on planet Earth for a long time. And for that reason, we are incredibly resourced.
Yeah.
And we just need to pay attention to both, like, those resources, mine those resources for direction, and also to the world we live in. Notice that it's orange outside and be like, this is not okay. Pay attention.
Yeah.
It's not okay that our food systems are broken. Not okay.
Well, thank you so
You're
much.
very welcome.
I really appreciate your time and the generosity of your answers. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and we get some clear air this weekend at the very least.
Yeah, me too. And thank you, Ashley, for the invitation and the wonderful, wonderful conversation. I hope it edifies someone as much as it's edified me to be present with you today.
Thank you again and have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.